Today we have Bill Harding on the stream. He's only calling in via phone. I don't think your image is currently working. And we actually read his previous research from 2023, at the end of 2023, beginning of 2024 for Get Clear, which kind of talks about the effects of CoPilot on GitHub. And by doing years of research, you can see a couple really interesting, I guess, facts that kind of came about. And the one that I thought was the most interesting was the amount of churn. So churn would be the same line changing within some small amount of time. Oh, hey, Bill, you're on now. Hey, welcome. There you go.
You.
Awesome. So anyway, so
Technology wizards.
It's surprising. It's surprising that you can people can program then have absolutely no idea how video works. It just is just a fact of life. But the big thing I think that was surprising was the increase in churn, which I thought was very interesting, and the increase in just copy pasta. And then going down. And the big one I believe said in this is that churn typically was low over the case of 6 months, whereas it's kind of like sped up. It's becoming every like 2 weeks, I believe, is the cycle that it was happening. So it's going from a line of code changing every 6 months on average in open source to every 2 weeks on average in open source. And that was kind of last year's big finding. Am I correct on that?
Yep, that was one of them. Yep.
Okay, I found that one to be the most startling, I guess, of them all, because I was very surprised that I was just very surprised to see that big of an impact, because that's a pretty big impact to almost double the churn rate and then to reduce the length of churn by a huge percentage.
Yeah, exactly. It's the impact of AI is being observed across many different dimensions that we are measuring. We have a database of 211 million lines of changed code that we're looking at. And so you can see this whether you're looking at the increase in copy pasted code. You can see this when you're looking at the increase in blocks of code that are getting duplicated from one file to another. And you can see this when you're looking at the speed at which code is getting revised now being so much faster than the speed it had been revised at 2 years ago. So all of those different dimensions are telling a very similar story, which is that we're getting faster at adding code, but we are getting much worse at revising it and refactoring it.
Interesting. All right. I mean, I want to jump into the philosophical side of things first, but let's hold off on that side of things, and we can open. I've just opened up the 2024 like evaluation. Is there any particular parts you want to kind of talk about that you find the most interesting as the result in 2024? Now that we kind of talked a little bit about 2023 and its result.
Sure. Yeah. Let's go to page. Trying to find page.
Really good research, by the way. This is super awesome. I think this stuff is super interesting.
Yeah, thank you. It's several weeks to put it all together. And so last year it was, very, I think, provocative for a lot of different people that are trying to understand, we have all this measured productivity increase, but is there another side to that? And there isn't any, GitHub's not going to tell you about the code quality reductions. They're going to tell you about the productivity increase. Yeah. And so I feel like we're kind of a counterbalance to what all of the AI providers are giving us, which is measurements about how productivity is increasing. And we're trying to provide something interesting to sort of fill out the rest of that picture. So page 8, I think, is maybe a good starting place for how code has been changing over time. And this is showing us how each of these colors is representing types of code changes that have happened on a year-to-year basis. So the blue is added code, which you can see every year we're getting more and more added code as a percentage of all types of code changes. Whereas the green area up here, that's moved code. That's code that's getting refactored from one file to another. And you can see a couple years ago, that was more than 20% of all code was code that's getting modified and reused. And that has plummeted to now being less overall percentage of all code operations than copy pasted code. So that is really one of maybe the most shocking finding that for me was to see that this is the first year where there was more copy pasted code that we measured than there was moved code. And that does not seem like it's going to be, from a maintainability standpoint, something that is going to be manageable in the years to come if we have to keep managing these repos that have more and more duplicated blocks and more copy pasted code that doesn't ever get refactored.
Can I ask a couple clarifying questions? When you say copy and pasted, what you're saying is that there's effectively the same piece of code multiple times in a repo, that from one file to another file you've effectively added code that was directly the same as another piece of code, like word for word the same, not like close to where maybe you could metaprogram your way out of it, but just like literally the same copy pasta. And
literally the same, exactly. And what's worse is that the data we're looking at in this particular graph, this is looking at copy paste within a single commit. So this is not just that there's the same code that exists twice in a file that changed in a year. This is within one commit. There is an ever greater percentage of developers pasting the same line, an identical line that's not a keyword line. It's not
like a variable declaration saying like data, right? Like var data does not appear multiple times. That's not what you're saying. It's actually like a for loop summing something. I guess that makes sense in some sense that, like, at one point, so if you're using JavaScript, let's just pretend we're talking about JavaScript. There's no standard method for summing an array, right? Like, you don't have the Python utilities of just sum. So instead, you have to write that sum. And it's become exceptionally cheap to write that sum function because you can just go function sum, and then it's just like, and here's the rest of the function. All done. You're good to go. So I guess I guess in some sense I can understand why perhaps that's happening. Do you have any insights into that type of copy pasta? Is it just as simple as I said, that like there's no sum function, now it's cheap to write sum function? Or is it actually like more complex copying and pasting?
Well, it can be both, because when you're looking at a operation that is happening for 13% of all of the lines of code that we've observed being committed in the last year, that means that more than 10% of the lines that change in every commit are duplicated within that commit. And so in some cases, it's going to be a sum method in JavaScript, but in a lot of other cases, it's going to be that you're maybe writing a CSS file and you have specified a set of selectors that are going to style a div. And instead of reusing that selector, you start to write another class declaration, and the AI suggests, hey, how about we use these 10 lines that you just wrote at the top of the file? And so instead of reusing that class declaration that already existed, AI is making it so easy for us to just press tab, and now we have the exact same CSS declaration at multiple places in the file that are getting committed within a single commit.
Interesting. Another thing I see is that deletions are also looking like they're taking up a larger portion as well.
Yeah, deletions have increased nominally. The deletions that I think are most concerning are the ones that you had talked about at the beginning, the churn type deletions, where you have code that is getting newly authored and then it's getting deleted within 2 weeks after that. And that is something that we're seeing continue to accelerate every year. The data on that is on page 18. And that's where you can see that every year that code assistants have become more available, the percentage of code that changes in less than 2 weeks is growing. We have 70% of code that we measured that was new lines changing within 2 weeks in the past year, whereas code getting revised after 1 to 2 years, which is usually more of a legacy refactoring operation, that is only a third of what it had been previously. And so all of this really corresponds to what Google Dora also observed in their code quality report this year, where they measured that increased AI adoption, if you increase it by 25%, you can expect that your rate of defects is going to increase by about 7%. And I think those are kind of telling us the same story, that it is more and more common that we're committing code and we're deploying code, and then we're going back and saying, oh, wait, that doesn't do what I thought it would do. And that is something that previously it was much more difficult to automatically write all this code that you hadn't tested.
Mm. Is any of this reflective? Like, especially, so I mean, I would assume that, especially given, let's see, what page 8. Let me just go back to page 8. This one right here, this higher amount of copy pasting and all that. In my head, at least, that would assume one of two things. One, copying is just so cheap and so free that Copilot makes it easy for all to do. Or B, that we've just had a massive influx of new people kind of joining into, say, the GitHub universe, that it's allowing people who don't necessarily have as much experience or knowing why these things are as dangerous. Is AI just allowing people with less experience to be able to join up in these more, say, or the repos that you're looking at, versus it just being cheap? Is there any indication into that? Because I'm curious if this is an experience problem or an AI problem, or both.
Yeah, I think there's signals for both. If you look at page 12, that is where we included our data for the prevalence of duplicated code blocks. These are code blocks that have at least 5 lines that are identical and have been copy pasted from one file or one directory to another, not necessarily within the same commit. So this is subtly different than that copy paste data we were looking at, even though it's telling a similar story. And this duplicated code block data is showing us that in 2022, we only detected about 0.5% of commits that involved large duplicated blocks of code that had already existed somewhere else in the repo. Whereas in 2024, that was the devil's number, 6.66% of all commits that involved a block of code that was at least 5 lines that already existed somewhere else in the repo. So that suggests to me that AI is making it very easy for new developers to just reuse an implementation, whether they could have called into it and they could have dried it previously, but now they can just press tab, recreate it. And in the moment, that's an effective way to get the task done. But then when you zoom out to what the implications are over the coming years, that means you now have multiple implementations of the same idea. And when you're going to want to change one of those implementations, if you don't change the other ones, that is a very common source of bugs that a lot of research has been able to identify. Like clone blocks that don't change together is something that very consistently creates issues for repos that have that, and more repos have that. The repos we were analyzing for this year's data were like Visual Studio Code, Google Chromium. These are, major apps that all of us are using, and more of these apps are big blocks of duplicated code that are going to have to be co-maintained unless something changes.
Wow. Yeah, because I remember last year the duplicated code blocks being a big thing because it increased. I think I think your average started in 2020 last year as well, or last year's report, and so it's been kind of it's been fairly low, which you'd expect some level of duplication because there is reasons to duplicate that it's okay to do in some levels. But this is surprising. Like that last year's jump was surprising, but this year's is like it's really big. It's an equal proportion of jump again, which is definitely
Exactly.
suggesting a trend, because sometimes you just have like maybe you searched a bad repo, maybe there's always a chance that something you over indexed into something, but 2 years running in a row, especially using very big popular repos, very shocking to see it double over again. Wow.
And I think as a developer, I've experienced this myself where if it's late in the day or if it's the weekend and I'm tired and I just want something to work, I'm not necessarily going to go scour the repo and figure out if there's an existing method or utility I can use. If the AI has a suggestion that looks like it'll probably work, even if it's 15 lines, I'm quite likely to say, okay, it seems like it'll work. And I think that's the pattern that is happening more and more, is that people they don't need to go back and discover whether or not this code block already existed somewhere else. You just see the AI giving it to you, on a tab press, and you take it. And the more that this happens, the more that we are going to start changing that code block in one place, but then having it in two or three other places where it doesn't get changed. And that is what I think a lot of maintaining repos is going to involve in the coming years, if we continue to uh, have this trend moving in the direction it has been in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, especially given the fact that additions have been the biggest kind of, they've seemed like they've been growing. They continue to keep
They
growing. So that
are.
means there's just more and more code being added. And it's very hard sometimes to be able to tell if the thing being added. I mean, I know this is talking about individual commits, and this one's kind of over time commits. And so over time
Hmm.
commits, it's very hard to tell duplicates. Like you go into any large code base, you could probably find quite a few duplicates. And I bet you something like Tree Sitter could be a very great utility to look into this and really kind of discover a lot of the duplicates. And perhaps there's like a cool tool that could be analyzed to be shared. But nonetheless,
Get clear.
it is. Did you use Tree Sitter?
No, but Get Clear, the tool that we use, has its own duplicate block
Oh,
detection, so
nice. Oh, you
that's
do.
another
Okay.
one.
Okay, yeah, get
Yep.
clear, do
Uh,
that. I mean,
um,
that's actually, I mean, this sounds great because this is a really, I mean, to me, this is definitely a sign of you're about to hit a point where you're just putting in a lot, you're just making a lot of junk stuff. It's not that it's bad, it works. It's the ever increasing pursuit of productivity over, say, craft, if that's a proper way to kind of define the two ends on the spectrum. But it also does lead, like you say, like you will fix bugs and then it'll be production that discovers the other code block that was identical. It's not you, it's not your QA, it's not your automated tests. None of them hit it. It's just some later thing that just causes so much down the road headache. So that is
and it
oof.
and it's demoralizing. Like when you're in the
It's
process of implementing a ticket and you suddenly discover that part of what you want to modify has been duplicated somewhere else, and now you have to decide whether you want to also modify that version, and that means you have to understand that other version. And it's just really dispiriting if you think something is going to be so simple to implement, but then you discover that a key piece of what you're trying to change is duplicated in a bunch of other places. Do you change those other places or do you not? That's something that I think we're all going to be encountering more and more often if this percentage of duplicated blocks continues to move in the direction that it has the last couple of years.
yeah. I mean, do you have a 2025 projection for duplication blocks?
I mean, just eyeballing the way that it's gone, I mean, it looks like it's going to be at least 10%. I haven't fed that to OpenAI to do a formal projection yet, but it grew what, 5% or five times, 5x in just the past year. So that ain't good.
Yeah,
uh, if it is, there's only so far I think it can go. We're not going to have 50% of our code be duplicated blocks,
fair.
but uh, we're probing what the limit is for how much duplication is possible before it becomes a front and center problem that lead developers have to cope with. So yeah, I think 10% is probably around what I would imagine we're going to see in 2025. The other piece of this that goes along with the duplicated blocks is page 19, that shows how much new code is getting revised shortly after and how that is changing on a year-to-year basis. And so you can see like 2021, if you're looking at non-test code that churned in under 2 weeks, that was about 5%. Now it's closer to 7%, 6.5 or 7%, which seems like a not huge change, but that's 30, 40% more code that is having to be revised shortly after it gets deployed. And that, I think, is that 7% greater defect rate that Google measured with AI adoption. When you're deploying duplicated code, it is that much more likely you're going to need to go in and modify multiple locations afterward. And that is not what developers want to be working on, but that's what we have to work on if we keep moving this direction where we're using code assistants that don't even have the capability of refactoring or deleting code. All they know how to do is just add.
Mm-hmm. Just maybe perhaps more of a partially philosophical question. Is the difference between a multi-line, do you think there's a difference in multi-line copilots versus, say, like an autocomplete, an AI, LLM autocomplete that only does single-line implementation type autocomplete? Would that change some of this game around?
I mean, if we restricted the suggestions to being a single line, then absolutely, you're not going to be able to automatically duplicate a 10-line block if you are restricted to a more simple suggestion that is available. So yes, I think that could change things. I haven't seen that as an option offered by any of the AI assistants. Have you?
No. I'm sure
Yeah.
there is. I'm sure there is like some things that, some options that actually do that. I've just never explored the option set. I've been out of the Copilot game for a little bit now. I kind of want to jump back in again and see how good, if it's gotten better, what's going on with it. But no, I have not looked into something like that because that was actually one of the primary reasons why I quit using it, because it was too much reviewing of code, and I am not someone that just
Yeah.
blindly copies and pastes, and so I just felt like I kept falling in and out of what's called like the zone, because I kept having to be like, oh, what was that? It's too much mental stimulation for me to be able to handle.
It, Yeah, well, it's a huge context shift to go from creating things and using, your mental model of a system to create the next piece of it versus reviewing things. I think that, that's one of many reasons that a lot of developers, including myself, are so slow to review pull requests, is because it's a big context shift to go
Mhm.
into reviewing other people's code. And I think that GitHub Copilot, especially when it is able to make these 10, 15 line suggestions, you have to suddenly, from writing code into reviewing code. Is this really code that is going to work? Is this code I've seen before? Is this code that is using the same conventions that our repo already has? And so I think that back and forth of being a code author and a code reviewer is a non-trivial mental overhead that is constantly being paid when you are using Copilot.
Hold on, I'm
Back
having
and
some.
forth of being a code author
This
and a
I
code
think this is a
reviewer
Twitter thing. Yeah,
is
Twitter.
non-trivial.
Twitter, there's a bug. Nate. It will just unpause itself after a certain amount of time and then just start playing. Sorry, so that last like maybe 2 seconds, you got duplicated code there, or duplicated words. Talking about duplication, you were literally getting duplicated at the exact same time. Yeah, that was crazy.
Yeah.
Is
But
there
no,
any other highlights you want to kind of go around what you think is particularly cool points? And then I'd love to kind of switch gears and hear more of your thoughts on the philosophical side of all this.
Yeah, no, I think that those are the three main points that I think were significant from our research. The fact that this was the first year that we switched over from having more moved and refactored code to more copy pasted code. 2024 was I guess a dubious milestone in that regard, and that seems very consequential for teams that are going to have a long-lived repo. The other one was this increase in the frequency of code that is revised within 2 to 4 weeks after being authored, and the third one is the 5x-ish increase in the duplicated blocks. And so all of those really dovetail with what Google Dora had reported, which is, yes, a lot of AI users report that they feel more productive when they're using Copilot, but I think that notion of being more productive is making more commits and authoring more lines, and I don't know that is the type of productivity that a team really wants to focus on if they're trying to write maintainable code. If they're going to have to keep using this code in the 2 or 3 years after it's authored, I think it's going to be more and more problematic that we keep making these huge blocks that are either completely cloned or largely cloned. And yeah, those are the most significant takeaways that I had when I looked into the data we'd accumulated this year.
Wow. Hey, just Flip, you can take this part out quickly. What's your do you have a Twitter?
Yeah, Get Clear is our main Twitter account that we use. We're not super active there, but we do post our research and our other blog posts and whatnot there.
Okay, do you want to also share, do you want to have your Twitter as well shared?
Sure, William B. Harding.
Because I'd love to give credit where credit's due. This guy?
Nope,
Yeah.
William B.
Oh,
Harding.
that's William B. Hard. Slightly different sounding. There you go. William B. Harding. This
Similar.
looks correct.
Yeah,
Correct. Awesome.
that's me.
All right. Awesome. I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna throw this in there. Yeah, I did William B. Hard. Very very different. Like when you really think about it, it sounds completely different.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that, I think a big part of what's happening now is that teams are having to decide what is the measure of productivity that they're going to focus on. And if managers are going to interpret productivity as more lines of code authored or even more commits authored, then I think that is going to continue to create incentive for more and more pressing tab. And that pressing tab for where copilots are right now, where there is no revision, there is no deletion that becomes available, it's a problem, and I'm not sure how teams are going to reconcile that need to keep code maintainable over the longer term.
Do you think that is it solely just on Copilot? Are there things like ChatGPT or these kind of other like copy and pasting over, or even something like Cursor that's more of an integrated version of that experience? Are those also playing roles into this, or do you think it's mostly a kind of a Copilot experience? Copilot is really easy to copy and paste with.
Yeah, I don't think that the Find and the OpenAI and the Anthropic programming tools are contributing nearly as much because they don't know what code is already in your repo to duplicate. But I think that any IDE integrated code assistant is going to be looking at the code that's already there, and that is the context that it has available to make its suggestions. And that is the situation where I think that this proliferation of copy paste and this proliferation of duplication is going to continue to be problematic unless we start to find incentives to try to consolidate code and trying to delete code that isn't actually that doesn't need to be written and copied 3 times in 3 different places. You could just reuse the same thing.
So I'm going to try to make the best defense I honestly can. I'm going to try to steel man as much as I can, kind of a really like accelerationist, like, or AI accelerationist kind of viewpoint, which is that ARs are going to continue to write more and more larger portions of our code, and what we find good or maintainable is likely going to not line up with how an AI might find something maintainable. So, looking at this data, is it actually really a problem, or is it more just showing that we are entering into a world of just pure AI doing the things that we used to do?
I think that right now, GitHub Copilot's context window is not widely published, but from the research that I undertook, it seems like they're looking at 8K, maybe up to 64K of context window size. When you have that amount, that small amount of code to draw from, I don't think that we're close to a point where AI is going to be able to look at the totality of its repo and to be able to maintain the code that it's writing. And so, is there a future where the context window is large enough? Is Cursor going to be able to, as it indexes an entire repo, is it going to be able to identify the circumstances where 2 fairly similar modules can be combined? Hypothetically, it could, but I have not seen any attempt yet to create the UX for that. And trying to think of how that UX would work is difficult. And so uh, it's not impossible that AI is going to be able to maintain this mess of duplication that we're in the process of creating, but it's going to require a lot bigger context windows than has been available historically, and it's going to require, I think, an evolution in how we interact with the IDE and how we instruct our AI to implement the ticket that we're working on. And so I guess it's not impossible, but it's a couple steps away from where we are now. And it's very unclear to me that the companies even really realize that this is a problem, or that they're thinking about the implications of the duplication that is increasingly becoming prevalent.
Um, if I were a junior engineer today, and I didn't have, say, I only just went on Twitter, I went to my college, I went to Twitter, and I'd have a really strong sense, I think, that if I'm not using these tools, I am absolutely ruining my future. I'm not keeping up with all that kind of stuff. If you were to give some advice on how would if you were a junior, how would you approach these situations that both utilizes what you think is the best parts of AI, or which parts should you consider more deeply? How would you effectively hone your craft and all of that given this platform? What would you say?
I think that you have to try to prove that you have the capability of understanding the repo well enough to modify the code that already exists, and you understand the repo well enough to consolidate uh, similar areas of code that could be reused and tested better if they were reused. And so to my mind, the greatest contribution that a junior developer could make that would impress their boss would be proving that they are incorporating the systems that already exist in the repo as they're implementing their tickets. Ideally, they're not just reusing that code, but they're actually incrementing or incrementally iterating on the initial implementation of that. And it still relies on the manager having a visceral understanding of why it's a bad thing to have the same code duplicated in 5 or 10 areas. But I think managers are going to become increasingly aware of that if the defect rate continues to increase, as has been observed thus far in the AI adoption. And so that is really what makes humans unique at this point, is the ability to digest the various methods that are similar to what you need, and to be able to interpret which of those methods could actually be uh, reused, slightly upgraded, better documented, better tested, and then used by multiple systems. So it's it's a lot to ask for a junior developer. Understanding code that you're not familiar with is hard, but that is something that they can offer that AI is not going to be able to recreate. At the same time, you definitely, I think, want to have those AI familiarity with those AI tools enough to where you can use their benefits. Their benefits are certainly front and center when you're writing documentation. I think when you're writing tests, I think in those cases, you don't have to worry about the duplication as much, and it's more just upside. So I think you certainly want to carefully choose the AI tools you're using, and you want to rely on those when you're in the midst of tasks that can benefit from them. But proving that you understand the existing code well enough to reuse, modify, and iterate on it is, I think, a real differentiator for junior developers that are trying to help their team write maintainable code.
Yeah. Wow. This is a this is a very impressive, I'd say, piece of research. I think the moved part, I'm very moved by this move part myself. That it is a very good skill not to rewrite, not to feel the need to rewrite stuff, even if rewriting is cheap, but to try to make stuff actually, to be able to up level it a little bit, to be able to handle more stuff. Or I mean, there are times where you have to rewrite, and that's just an inevitable part of all software that we see. This is absolutely awesome. And so you work. So even though you never even once asked about any of these things, I do feel quite the responsibility in me. I don't know anything about GitClear. What is GitClear?
GitClear is a tool that we've been building over the last 6 years in the hopes to help developers, managers, and CTOs be able to actually follow how their code base is evolving. And so, as an individual developer, I love using GitClear just to recall what the big stuff I've been working on over the last week or the last month is. If you go to my GitHub profile, GitHub /WB Harding, you can see on there that I have change lists that were generated by GitClear, where if you scroll down a little more, it actually shows some of the main things that I've implemented lately from Jira. It also shows how much I have been evolving repos lately. And so having this easy ability to both recall for my own sake, but also to relate to my team and to let our customers see what we've been working on. All of those are hard to convey when you have a bunch of repos. It's hard to follow if you're working on a team that works across 20 different repos like ours does, where important things are changing and where the opportunities to reuse a library are. GitClear helps to basically shine a spotlight on that and let both yourself follow your own code and to let your teammates understand what you've been working on and where the, the code that you've been writing could help them if they're looking to reuse the canonical version of the utilities that they have in the repo. So yeah, GitClear, we also focus on pull requests and trying to get rid of what I think is one of the most annoying problems with GitHub, where when you're reviewing a big ass pull request and you see a file that says it's deleted, but then you scroll down a couple minutes later and you find that all those lines actually were just moved to a different file.
Yeah.
GitClear is well trained, and that's what gives us this ability to present the data. It's well trained at recognizing when moved code occurs, and so you don't waste all this time trying to understand why did they delete this file, or why did they add all these lines that I already know exist somewhere else, and then you scroll down and you're like, oh, they didn't delete it,
Yeah.
it was actually just moved.
I hate
So
that. I
those
hate
are
that. I hate that so much. Trying to like follow someone's change when it's just like a huge red and then later on it's like a huge green. And you're like, okay, something likely changed. I just don't know what has changed. So now I have to like go through these two and try to figure out what was the actual differences between them. It's always like one or two
little
lines.
line.
Yeah. Oof.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, so that's part of the goal that we're trying to do, is just make it easier to follow the real gist of what changed in a repo. And when you can understand the most important things that are being updated and modified, it opens the door for all kinds of interesting questions that you can look at around code reuse and just around where the bugs are originating within the different directories and where the tech debt is in your repo.
Very cool. Very, very cool. I think that's very awesome. Thanks for taking the time to do this. I think this was fantastic. Research is always just spot on. I really enjoyed reading the paper last time. I think this paper's very well worth the read. I know we only touched on a couple points, but I don't want people to just take that, take that as the only thing you need from this paper. This is great research that comes out of here every single time. So,
well, I appreciate that. Yeah, and like I said, the research will be available on our site as of tomorrow, and so anybody can come and download it and give their boss the case for why it would be better to understand how much duplicated code is being introduced into the repo instead of being blind to it and just hoping for the best. So
yeah.
That's what I hope that we can help provide, is more maintainable repos by having a more consolidated set of concerns that the developer has to work on, instead of just having the repo that spans to infinity and you can't understand, where things are located.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because honestly, like the idea that lines created, lines added, or the amount of just stuff you're pushing through is not necessarily a great measurement. I think someone linked this earlier, but it's the Bill Gates quote, which is measuring developers' productivity in lines is the same thing as measuring plane builders' productivity and weight added, which is just like, well, that's not necessarily, like that's not the point. The plane, the plane in its entirety is the thing we're attempting to build. So
Exactly.
awesome, Bill. This is
Cool.
fantastic. Thank you very much for being on here.
Yeah, thanks. I hope that your audience gets some value from it, and I'll keep watching. Love what you do here.
Hey, appreciate that. Thank you, bud.
Cool. See ya.
See ya.